Testing one, two, three. Hey, Pretty Girl Club. So, I did a poll recently where I had you guys vote on if you had to choose kind of your favorite region of the US as far as like pretty privilege or culture out of the West Coast, the East Coast, the South, and the Midwest. You guys chose the South. I know you have pretty privilege everywhere. I know you're going to have a good experience no matter where you go. So, I'm probably going to make some sort of video about every region that I've lived in the US. Maybe I'll talk about the pros and cons of every region. But today, I kind of want to go on a rant about my experience in the South. And I just want to talk about some of the pros and cons. By the way, if you're new to this channel talks about a lot of the nuances of Blackness. And here on this channel, we center ambiguous Blackness. So, you know how they have that phrase, unambiguously Black, like you're monoracial, maybe you're monocultural as well. This channel deals with all of the other aspects of Blackness. So, any sort of ambiguous Blackness, if you are considered to be a quote unquote privileged Black person because of your skin tone, your hair texture, your facial features, if you are a mixed or like multiracial, biracial Black person, this channel focuses on the other side of Blackness that has not really been talked about on YouTube. So if you're looking for some controversial, slightly toxic content, I'm your girl. But in terms of why Exoticals love the South, I want to start off by saying if I had to vote on that poll, I also would have chosen the South. I adore the South. I really love the South a lot. And I want to say that in my experience, one of the things that I love about the South is there is an acceptance here of multiracial and especially multi-generationally mixed people as opposed to when I've lived on like the East Coast or the West Coast. Because on the West Coast, there's lots of one dropping that I experienced. So on the West Coast, for example, I never really heard terms like light skin, dark skin, mixed, or, you know, she's like a light skin Black. I had never heard that terminology a lot on the West Coast because on the West Coast, it was more like if you're not white passing, because there was kind of a lower population of mixed race people as well as monoracially Black people, you were just kind of one dropped into Blackness. And for reference, the Black population in California is only 5%. So if you've got 95% non-Black people and only 5% of Black or Black adjacent people, that actually makes more sense for you to be one dropped and for people to not really understand the nuances of your particular type of Blackness. So that's one of the main differences I noticed with the South. I've noticed that the South is a lot more accepting and a lot more respectful and almost like they have kind of like this reverence for people who have kind of this mixed race or multi-generationally mixed ancestry. I really do think that a lot of it has to do with Creole culture. Shout out to the Creoles. Shout out to the Creole women, not the Creole men. I have my own beef with Creole men, but that is probably the first thing that I noticed with living in the South versus living on the West Coast. So in the South, there's definitely a respect, and there are also just more multi-generationally mixed people in the South. I've noticed that like when I have been in the South, more people have just asked me straight up. They actually ask me questions in the South versus making assumptions about me on the West Coast. So on the West Coast, people would kind of throw you into like some sort of Blackness, which is fine. But I've noticed in the South, people will just ask me like, oh, are you Creole? Or like, what's your background? So they will allow me to tell them my identity versus the West Coast. And then on the East Coast, I feel like they will make assumptions about me, but then they'll ask me a question based on their assumption. So for example, they'll be like, are you Dominican? So it's like, okay, so you assumed that I was Dominican and you asked me if I was Dominican versus in the South, they will just ask me like, oh, what's your background? So they let me tell them versus either one dropping me into Blackness or assuming I'm Dominican or Puerto Rican or something else. And then they kind of ask me based on that. So that's one thing I can think of is there seems to be kind of more of an acceptance of mixed race people from what I've noticed. I've met a lot of different Creoles with like living in the South. By the way, I don't share what part of the US I live in on my YouTube channel, but for reference, I have lived in the South, the West Coast, and on the East Coast. So if I had to judge based on the South, I've met lots more exoticals, like friends who they have lots of different admixtures. I've met like girls who have Creole backgrounds, girls who have just all types of different things in their bloodline. And even if they identify as Black, there is still kind of this understanding of, yeah, we're Black, but we also are like a multiracial type of Black. So I've noticed that in the South, there's more respect for their Blackness. I've noticed that the mixed race people in the South that I've been around, they have a respect for their Blackness versus some of the mixed people that I've met on the West Coast, East Coast, or from the Midwest, where there's almost like a disrespect sometimes for their Blackness or kind of a preference for their non Black side. You guys know that I don't like doing that. I don't like picking a side. I don't like pedestalizing non Blackness over Blackness. No, I'm not a divester or like somebody that kind of pedestalizes whiteness, especially as a person who's grown up in a white community. But another thing that I love about the South is there is an acknowledgement of light skins. And when I say that, I'm not saying it as in there's colorism. What I mean is like, so for example, if I meet other people who are light skinned, I've noticed that other light skinned or like biracial or mixed race people, they acknowledge their mixtures, they acknowledge their different skin tones and stuff. And they don't accuse you of being a colorist or texturist, featurist, whatever, racist. So I've noticed that there's just more openness when it comes to exotical men and women interacting with each other, or at least when we are around each other and there are no unambiguous people. So I don't know how a lot of the exoticals act around unambiguous men and women, but I like the camaraderie that I've experienced whenever I'm around other admixed people in the South. So, for example, I have walked into Creole restaurants before, and like the guy who owns the restaurant, he'll ask me, like, "Oh, are you Creole?" Or I've been around other women, like at work or whatever, and then they'll ask me questions like, "Oh, are you Creole?" I'm not Creole, by the way. But because of my phenotype, I've noticed that by them asking that, they're kind of trying to acknowledge my phenotype and they're trying to kind of build a camaraderie. I've noticed there's just more openness to build a camaraderie with one another when it comes to my experience with exotical men and women in the South. So I love that. I love the fact that I get to make jokes. I get to make mixed race jokes with people or like different natural hair jokes and stuff like that. Or I don't know. I just like that I have had more of a freedom of speech. One thing that I like, but also some people dislike this about the South, I like how much people have their freedom of speech in the South. I love that aspect of the South. I will say though, on the East Coast, they have that as well. So I like on the East Coast that people are also very blunt. I feel like on the East Coast, my bluntness and my assertiveness and my personality, a lot of people really like that about me on the East Coast. In the South, I feel like you can be blunt and you can be assertive, but it's more so behind closed doors. You may not like publicly shade somebody. You may not publicly flame them in front of everybody. But I have noticed that generally speaking, there's more of a relaxed culture in the South when it comes to talking about race or talking about the different nuances of Blackness. So I like that. I like the fact that in the South, people understand from what I've experienced, a lot of people in the Black or exotical community, they understand kind of the nuances of Blackness versus, let's say you're in California, there's only 5% of any kind of Blackness. A lot of people aren't really going to take the time to think about all of those aspects of Blackness. Same thing with the East Coast. I feel like on the East Coast, there are a lot of Black or mixed Black people who are like immigrants of different kinds. So if you're like an African American multiracial Black person like myself, then sometimes people are kind of like, oh, like, I don't know, maybe they don't know as much about that. Or it's almost as if some people feel like African Americans don't have their own culture. And I think that that's one of the most ignorant things I've ever heard in my life. But yeah, so another thing that I like about the South, if you, let's say you're dating or something like that, please do decentered dating for God's sakes. Please date from a decentered perspective if you are. But I've noticed that there are a lot more MLS men in the South. So mixed race, kind of multiracial or biracial guys. And they identify with every part of their background versus like denying certain parts of themselves. So I've noticed that when it comes to the guys, they will acknowledge that. Oftentimes they may ask you about your background too. So I've just noticed that there's kind of a higher MLS population. Oh, another thing I forgot to say though, when I'm speaking on the South, I'm not including Atlanta because I feel like Atlanta is its own special thing. I feel like Atlanta has a lot more unambiguous Black women. Just so you know, in Atlanta, in terms of African Americans, there are 3 black men to every 5 black women. So I'm just letting you guys know. So I feel like Atlanta is kind of an anomaly in a sense, even though Atlanta is a bit more diverse than what people think. But yeah, so one thing I've noticed though about the South in general is there are a lot of MLS people, so lots of mixed race women, mixed race men, multi generationally mixed, by the way. So that's something special about the South that I really love. I love the multi generationally mixed culture as opposed to a lot of 50-50 biracials only. So I feel like there's more nuance to the mixed race experience in the South. And I really love that. I love the diversity of mixed people in the South as well. The South and the East Coast have more dark-skinned exoticals. They have more darker skin. They have more dark-skinned mixed race people or dark-skinned people who have maybe kind of keener features or like looser hair textures versus the West Coast. So I like that. Another thing that I like about the South is chivalry and the courting culture. So in terms of like dating, if you care about that, um, even if you don't want marriage or something, or if you're socializing, you like being wined and dined. I noticed that the South is actually fantastic for that. I'm just being honest, or at least in my experience, I love the South in terms of the culture. I've noticed that because it's the Bible Belt, I don't know if it has to do with it being the Bible Belt, but I'm kind of thinking of that. I'm thinking of the history of the South and it having kind of this Christian or religious background. Yes, I know that there are some issues with Christianity. I've already done my rants about that. But one thing that I've noticed though is that when I'm in the South, I've just met more people in general who come from two-parent homes, whether it's black women, black men. As a matter of fact, you know what? Now that I think of it, all of my friends, whether they're unambiguous or mixed race, all of them come from like two-parent homes where their parents are married. And by the way, I'm not trying to pedestalize it. I don't want to come off like I'm pedestalizing marriage or like you're less than if you have a single parent. But that's something I've noticed though. There's just a different culture where there's more of kind of like this chivalrous culture amongst a lot of the men. And there's more of a culture of courting. So asking the woman on a date, taking the woman on a date versus like the East Coast or West Coast. A lot of West Coast guys, West Coast culture, from what I've experienced, has been more like hookup culture. And then East Coast culture, very similar, but I've noticed on the East Coast, it's more like they will try to date you until they get the sex and then you're ghosted, or Midwestern guys, same thing. Like they're dating you and then once they get the sex, then they're ghosted versus the South. I've met a lot more marriage minded people. So if you're one of those girls, I don't promote or pedestalize any sort of marriages and stuff on this channel. But if you do care about that, I've noticed that the South definitely has that as more of a norm. And so that's always an option too. So I like that there are a lot more relationship options. So yes, there is kind of like a hookup culture. There's kind of the casual dating culture. There's like this whining and dining and sugar baby culture. And then there's also the marriage culture. So well, I guess it kind of depends on if you're religious or not. I personally am not religious, but I've just noticed more diversity in the dating culture versus on the West Coast. I feel like it's more sugar babying. You're trying to get into Hollywood or something like that. Maybe you want to do modeling. Maybe there's more of this IG baddie type of culture on the West Coast. And then East Coast, it's almost like 50-50, 50-50 culture because people are trying to survive because the cost of living is so much higher. I don't want to call it struggle culture, but I've just noticed the South, it's almost as if they have maintained these traditions from generations before. So even though I'm no longer Christian, I do appreciate that part of it because what if I did ever decide like, okay, I want to try something different, or I care about kind of more of this traditional sort of lifestyle, then I feel like there's more of an option for that if you're dealing with Southern people. Another thing that I notice about the South that I really like is upward mobility and wealth. So, in terms of exotical men and women, or kind of like the Black community, I've noticed that there are a lot of people who have generational wealth, or at least from what I've experienced. So, as far as my background, oh, I forgot to say, I went to an HBCU. So, I have met so many people who are different alums from different HBCUs in the South. Lots of people have generational wealth, whether it's like they inherited something from their parents, whether it's property, multiple properties, some land or something. Think of like Boyce Watkins, Erica Williams. I'm just naming random YouTubers so you guys get an idea. Shira Seven, maybe even Shira Seven's husband. And by the way, this is not I'm not judging any of those people that I just mentioned, but I'm just trying to think of random people who I kind of feel embody the types of people that I've been around as far as my experiences from being in the South. So it's more so those types of people. I've noticed that there's this stereotype that a lot of black or black adjacent people are thugs and stuff. Thankfully, I don't really have that experience with the Black community, so I actually do not stereotype Blackness as automatically being thugs. I've noticed that a lot of people, they seem to think a lot of people in the Black community seem to think that most Black women are kind of like sexy red or something like that, or like that's how Black culture is. I have actually never had that experience. I feel like the thug thing is more of a subculture, although I could be wrong. I hope I'm not wrong. But one thing I like about the South is there's a huge population of bougie Black people, like bougie mixed race Black people, bougie Creole women, bougie Creole guys, bougie everybody. Well, I won't say everybody's bougie, but there are a lot more middle class to upper middle class people. So that is something that I feel like resonates with me based on my background. And I also like the HBCU culture. So I feel like because there are so many HBCUs in the South, I think that maybe it's more normalized to have a lot of educated exoticals. So, educated exotical women and men. I told you guys that I've actually been able to make friends with lots of different women, whether they're biracial, mixed race women, or unambiguous Black women. Some of them are attorneys. Like I have a couple of friends that are like attorneys. Some of them are doctors. I have multiple friends who have master's degrees or they work in public health. Some of them, like I know of some people who have like written different books or they've done podcasts or like so many accomplishments. So that's something that I feel like the HBCU culture has kind of contributed to. So I just feel like you run into a lot more educated people in the South, just simply based on the fact that there are so many opportunities for kind of up and coming Black or mixed Black people. So that's another thing that I actually like about the South. And then in terms of pretty privilege or dating or whatever, let's say you like that. Let's say you're a Creole woman and I don't know, maybe your boyfriend's like some Creole guy or something. I just feel like if you care about that, then you'd be more likely to meet someone who has a higher education in the South, partially based on kind of that HBCU culture. Because even if you think about HBCUs, let's say your type is like a professor, like an intellectual type. So that's kind of how I am. I consider myself to be intellectual, so I care about that too. Even if you think of the hiring practices of HBCUs, they tend to hire black slash mixed black professors and stuff like that. So I just feel like that there's a whole other class of people in the South. So if you are a bougie exotical, I can see why you voted on the poll for the South because you're going to encounter lots of people who are just as bougie as you. I feel like depending on what neighborhood and what state you live in, you may not have to worry as much about people actively trying to sabotage you because there are other people that also want to isolate themselves from like criminal activity and stuff. So you're not alone in that. With being in the South, I've noticed that the main women who have antagonized me have been women who are monocultural. So, like the monocultural hood women who they might be exoticals as well, but they tend to be monocultural. They tend to be from the hood themselves. And so they kind of like demonize me. But generally speaking, let's say it's like, I don't know, there are some unambiguous women from the South or some unambiguous men from the South. I've noticed that there's not as much antagonism with calling me bougie. Usually it's some sort of transplant or somebody that's like from another part of the US or something, and then they move to the South, or, you know, those are usually the types where they're actively trying to beef with me and all that. Oh, but another thing I was going to say though, like one of the negatives about the South, if you're a pretty exotical, is pick me culture. So even though there are going to be lots of kind of upwardly mobile people of all races, by the way, but especially if you are into, let's say you're a mixed race and your type is like a mixed race guy. Oh, that's what I forgot to say as well. Another thing is mixed race guys are highly, but I feel like this is true everywhere. Mixed race guys are highly sought after or pedestalized in the South, but I've noticed that that's true on the West Coast for sure. East Coast, I can't think of any examples right at this moment, but yeah. So mixed race men are heavily pedestal. I think of like the Chris Brown type, or maybe even like a Barack Obama type, or something like that. Another thing that I have noticed about the South is that you're pretty privileged. So this kind of ties into the chivalry and courting culture. So if a guy thinks you're pretty, I've just noticed that the approach in the South is different. Like a guy will just walk up to you. He will start an actual conversation more often than like West Coast or East Coast. I've noticed the West Coast and East Coast guys that I've been around, they're more forward about like sex or maybe your body or whatever. But as far as guys in the South, I've just noticed that the guys with a Southern background have been more likely to ask a woman on a date. And I'm not just talking about with myself, I'm just talking about with my friends too, whether they're unambiguous or whatever, no matter what race of guys they date. I've just noticed that the guys are more formal. There's a little bit more etiquette. That's what it is, etiquette. There's more of this culture where people seem to respect kind of like etiquette and manners a little bit more. But another thing that I've experienced with people from the South is controversial comments. So, for the people who have kind of inferiority complexes, I would say if you struggle with inferiority complexes in any way, do not move to the South, because I have heard people make controversial comments about whether it's a woman's weight, whether it's their skin tones, hair textures, or whatever. Like the people who say that the South is colorist, I can see why they're saying that or where that may come from. Because, for example, one of the most controversial comments that I've ever heard a guy make is, so there's this one guy, he was trying to hit on me, and he was a light skinned black guy. He was monocultural. So he had tattoos and, totally nothing, nowhere near anything that I would ever date, just being honest. But anyway, he had tattoos and shit. He looked like T.I., like the rapper T.I. He looked like that. And he was trying to like hit on me or whatever. And I remember him saying that, like, you're just my type. He was like, yeah, you're my exact type. You're tall, you're light skinned, you have the long hair. And I remember when he made that comment, I was in a very, very pro black phase because of my HBCU background. So, and also he was like my color. He was a little bit darker than me, but definitely light skinned still. But I was like, well, why are you saying that? Are you saying that if somebody is dark skinned, that you wouldn't like them? Like, I just straight up asked him that. And he was like, nope, if she ain't yellow, I ain't falling in love. So that comment, like, imagine, and by the way, there were only light skinned people in the room at this time. So I remember the only people that were there when he said that, it was him, his other friend, who was another light skinned guy, myself, and then my friend, who was a light skinned girl. So, first of all, I wonder if he would have said that comment if there would have been unambiguous people in the room. But also, I feel like that's a very controversial comment because let's say there was somebody there that was dark skinned, would they be offended by that? So I can see why some people say like the South is colorist, texturist, featurist, whatever, because sometimes I just feel like people in the South, they make these comments to where they're centering themselves, or maybe they're centering their own phenotype or their own preferences or whatever, to the point where they're not very considerate of other people's experiences and preferences. So that's kind of debatable. Some people may be offended by that comment, some people may not be offended by that comment. For me personally, because I was very, pro black or whatever, I was offended. But I guess I'm wondering to myself now that I'm thinking back on it, like, where did he get that from? Does he just have family members that all have the same phenotype? But then again, let's say that it was a dark-skinned black guy talking to a dark-skinned black woman, and let's say he says a comment like, hey, if she's not chocolate, I'm not falling in love. I like chocolate women. And let's say he's a chocolate black man. Do you still view it as colorist, or do you still view it as biased? I don't know. But I've noticed that I can see where people get offended sometimes by Southern culture, because sometimes people are so open with their preferences, or they're so open with like what they like or what they find attractive and stuff in terms of dating, to the point where if you do not meet that person's standards, if you happen to be in earshot of that, then you might get offended or something. So for example, even with white guys, let's say you date white guys. I've heard of some Southern guys where they will make comments saying, "Oh, a blue-eyed blonde, that's my type," or, "She had blonde hair and blue eyes and she was so beautiful." And that guy is a blue-eyed blonde. So if you're offended by comments like that, I would say do not go to the South or move to the South, because you're going to hear people making comments about women of other phenotypes probably, where, they really like that phenotype and they're more vocal about it, I've noticed. So if you meet a guy's particular type or preference, he's going to be vocal. So if you have friends who have a different phenotype than you, or if you have friends who maybe a guy expresses that she's his type and you get offended by that, definitely don't hang out around people from the South. I actually remember that I was with a friend, but I'm personally not offended by that, just so you guys know. So for example, one of my best friends growing up, she was a white girl. And I remember we were hanging out with these guys of all races, and there was one Mexican guy. There was a guy that was Hispanic there, and his preference was white girls. And I remember that me and my friend were just hanging out, we were talking, and he said that he prefers white girls. He just straight up said it, and he was trying to talk to my friend who was white. So I personally wasn't offended, because I'm not offended if somebody prefers something that looks different than myself, because I don't really compare myself to other women of different races. But I would say that if you struggle with that at all, or if you have any sort of insecurities in that area, the South will definitely amplify that. So whether your insecurity is about your hair texture, your skin tone, your body type, whatever it is, if you go to the South, you might hear somebody make comments that are promoting some other phenotype than your own. I've personally heard guys say they prefer dark skinned women, white women, Mexican, whatever. So that's just one thing that you have to keep in mind if you are going to be in the South. Another thing that I noticed about Southern culture is that my type of femininity, so kind of this bougie aesthetic, this bougie personality type, my type of femininity is valued. So on the West Coast, I've noticed that I tend to tap into my IG baddie aesthetic, kind of the influencer. I don't know, the influencer baddie. I've noticed that's what I tap into more so on the West Coast. On the East Coast, I tend to tap into kind of this gossip girl aesthetic, kind of this city girl, not city girl like JT from the City Girl, but I mean city girl as in Serena Vanderwoodson and Blair Waldorf, that sort of femininity. But in the South, I've noticed that my classic bougie stuck up vibe that I have supposedly, that actually seems to be very appreciated in the South. I don't seem to receive as much flack. I've noticed that generally speaking, the people who don't like this whole stuck up vibe tend to be people who have a Midwestern background, and in some cases, an East Coast background, as far as my personality goes. So, depending on your feminine essence or your feminine archetype, I feel like your experience with pretty privilege is going to vary based on the geographical location. So in the South, it seemed like a lot of people appreciated whether it was kind of the housewife type of femininity, kind of this pageant queen femininity. I noticed that that was appreciated in the South. Sort of this stuck up, kind of bougie black femininity. So almost like this, kind of like the stuck up Creole vibes, or kind of, I don't know how to explain it, kind of like the generationally wealthy black vibe. I noticed that that type of femininity has been appreciated in the South. Another thing that I wrote down was etiquette and manners are appreciated. In the South, a lot of people complimented me on like my manners, my charm. I noticed that charm is highly valued in the South. So if you're charming, I noticed that's one of my best personality traits in real life is I'm very charming. So if you are charming, I would recommend going to the South or being around people from the South, because Southern people, in my experience, they appreciate charm. So when I use that term charm, what I mean is like you're a good sport, you can laugh at yourself. So it's the exact opposite of a social justice warrior. If you're a social justice warrior, you're going to have a horrible time in the South. I'm just going to put it out there. If you're a social justice warrior, I recommend the Midwest or the East Coast. But as far as being in the South, though, charm is highly appreciated. So if you're a very smiley, very outgoing, think of like a pageant queen or something like that, that sort of poise. If you have a lot of poise, I've noticed that that's highly appreciated in the South. So that's another thing that I liked. I noticed that that kind of adds to your pretty privilege, or like it kind of added to my pretty privilege in terms of interacting with Southern people, kind of this poise. Being articulate is also highly valued in the South. This is one thing that a lot of people have told me is like, oh, the way that you articulate yourself, the way that you think, the way that you carry yourself, that is highly respected by Southern people. And I didn't know what anyone was talking about until actually experiencing more of the Southern culture. Because I try not to judge. When I say the South, I'm not just talking about one state, I'm talking about my experiences all throughout the South. So if you are very articulate, if you're highly educated, and then you also you kind of pedestalize both your blackness as well as your multiculturalism, that is highly respected and highly revered um, in the Southern culture, or at least from my experience. There's an appreciation for you if you can interact in different cultures and stuff. I've noticed that in some of the other cultures that I've experienced, like the East Coast people or like the Midwest people. Oh my God, I feel like I'm talking so much shit today about the East Coast and the Midwest. But no, like the Midwest in particular, I've noticed a lot of Midwestern people have called other people sellouts. Same thing with a lot of East Coast people saying like you don't come back to your hood, or you don't, kind of like there's this disloyalty to the hood. I have noticed that more so with East Coast and Midwest people. That's just my experience. But in the South, I've noticed that there is a respect for people who know how to navigate in different cultures. There's a respect for those who have fluid identities. Okay, so on the West Coast, I've noticed that status is highly valued. So, social media followers, what kind of car do you drive? What kinds of designer clothing do you have? On average, the credit card debt as well. In California, in particular, the credit card debt is higher than the national average, or at least last time I looked it up, it was higher than the national average. So, on the West Coast, I've noticed there's an emphasis on status, kind of almost like this Hollywood aesthetic. On the East Coast, I noticed there is an emphasis on education. Are you a congressman, a congresswoman? Are you heavily into politics? I've met a lot of people who have been into politics on the East Coast, lots of people who believe in conspiracies, lots of people who don't give a fuck about the car that you drive or your designer clothes. Are you an actual smart person? Are you a critical thinker? I've noticed that that's valued on the East Coast. But in the South, my experience is that it was kind of less judgmental because there is a diversity of experiences in the sense that there are kind of the slower paced Southern people who just sit on their porch and like sit in the rocking chair. There are those Southern people. And then there are the Southern people who are like farmers. And then there are the Southern people who are like Bible thumpers. But then there are also Southern people who are like the oil tycoons and like the pageant girls and stuff like that. So that's one difference that I also noticed in the South. So depending on how you want to navigate your social climbing journey, depending on like what type of culture you want or what your goals are, you can kind of decide based on that. So there's a lot of diversity of jobs in the South, I've noticed. Oh, another thing that I noticed about the South is that there are more like Black owned businesses and stuff. So you're more likely to find leveled up, non jealous women versus on the West Coast, where it's like you've got a bunch of people struggling to get into Hollywood, struggling to be IG models or video vixens or whatever, or on the East Coast, struggling to pay their rent, struggling to stay in the city, struggling to continue living in that place, or constantly worried about gentrification. So I like kind of the Black middle class of the South. I just feel like all of the Southern states, a lot of them have a stronger middle class of minorities. So depending on what your racial background is, let's say you have a mixed race background, Hispanic and Black background, there are lots of people who are Hispanic who have their own restaurants, their own businesses. I've seen people who have a Hispanic background, they'll be selling stuff out of the back of a truck. I've actually seen the same thing with some Black men as well, where they will be like smoking some they'll be making something in a smoker, like making some barbecue out of the back of a truck or something like that. So I've just noticed that the Southern culture has a lot of people who make money in kind of creative ways. The food culture, I guess that's really what it is. There are lots of Black owned or minority owned food businesses, whether they are a brick and mortar business or some sort of food truck. That's something else I noticed too when it comes to the South. So, in terms of navigating your pretty privilege or navigating kind of like your status and stuff like that, if you know people who have your background and they have a restaurant or something, maybe you can just go hang out at that restaurant, go hang out at that bar, only go to that salon, that hair salon or something, versus on the East Coast or the West Coast. My favorite hair salons and stuff have really been in the South and also on the East Coast. So on the East Coast, I like the Dominican salons and stuff like that because I feel like there are a lot of girls with type 3 hair. And then in the South, I feel like because there are a lot of women who have kind of this multi generationally mixed background, it's also easy to find hairstylists and stuff. So that's something else that you can think about in terms of social climbing. Another thing that I wrote down about Southern culture is body positivity. Dear God, larger women are more celebrated and accepted along with everyone else. So, the first thing that I noticed when going to the South was okay, so my background is I come from a majority white city and state. So lots of the people are very, very slim. So I feel like Beyonce, Meg The Stallion, and Kim Kardashian are fat. I'm sorry. I said what I said. I'm not saying it in a disrespectful way because I think they all are drop dead gorgeous, 10 out of 10. But for me personally, because of my cultural background, I consider all three of those women to be overweight and to be fat. So when I was at my biggest, my body looked like that. So I thought that I was like huge. I thought that I was gigantic because I was used to being around 6 foot tall women who are like size zero, like they have no fat on their body whatsoever. And they literally work out like 3 hours a day. So I was used to being around that, more of the Paris Hilton aesthetic, more of that body type, Nicole Richie, Paris Hilton. But in the South, I've noticed that women who have this Beyonce body type, this Meg The Stallion body type, this Kim K body type, even BBLs and stuff, that is just normalized and more celebrated along with everyone else. But one thing that stood out to me in the South was that women who have a butt and boobs, a lot of those women, they don't care about not wearing a bra, for example. I've seen so many women like going braless and they'll have like double D's or something just walking around and they're very confident and they look good and everything. And nobody makes fun of them. Nobody's like pointing at them and laughing. I've noticed sometimes the red pill men will laugh at them online and stuff, but red pill men, they don't have any influence in real life. So I don't take anything they say seriously. The body positivity and kind of the body acceptance of the South, as well as single mother acceptance. I've also noticed that in the South, women who are single mothers can still receive a high pedestal. I've never noticed that. Definitely not on the West Coast. On the East Coast, maybe. On the West Coast, hell no. Midwest, not as much. But in the South, it's almost as if the family culture, kind of this culture of like people getting married and kind of like the Bible Belt and then people getting divorced or whatever, having kids, it seems to be almost like more normalized. And that could be based on a lot of things. I don't know why, but I've just noticed that a lot of the women that I've encountered who are from the South who have kids, I've never seen a woman from the South be ashamed of like having a child or something like that, or try to hide it, like, oh my God, I have a kid. Like, nobody's gonna want me, nobody's gonna like me. I haven't noticed that as much in the South. I've noticed it kind of with like West Coast women or East Coast women, Midwestern women, but in the South, I've just noticed that having kids and stuff, it doesn't seem to be looked down upon. In fact, I've actually noticed some people talking shit about child-free women, people from the South, whether they're women or men. So that's also another interesting thing. It's almost as if the conservative culture of the South kind of is creeping in that way, where it's like, oh, you're child-free, or oh, you're pro-life, or you're pro-choice. That's weird. You're liberal. You're a modern woman. So yeah, like the body positivity. So if you are a plus size or if you're thick or if you have some sort of like mid-sized body or something like that, or I don't know, maybe if it's I was going to say because it's really hot in a lot of places in the South, I think that could also be a part of why it's more normalized to kind of like go braless or to wear like these short booty shorts and like your butt's just hanging out and stuff. Well, I've noticed that on the West Coast too, though. A lot of women have like their butt hanging out and their boobs hanging out. But the difference with the West Coast is your butt is going to be either professionally done, like a BBL, maybe a skinny BBL or something. And same thing with boobs. Boob jobs, I've noticed, are a lot more common on the West Coast from what I've seen versus the South. But I also feel like part of that is because the West Coast has way less Black women in general, way less Black people. So using California as an example, like I said, the population is 5%. And I can put up screenshots of these different stats if I remember when I'm editing this. So yeah, I just feel like in the South, because the food there is so good, I don't know if maybe it's just accepted to be a little bit thicker. And when I say thick, I mean Meg the Stallion and Kim K and Beyonce. I guess like generally speaking, they're not considered fat, but I think it's just because of my cultural background. I just probably have a different standard. Another thing that I've noticed when it comes to pretty privilege in the South is that a lot of different fashion styles are more acceptable. So I did not witness anybody like specifically making fun of clothing in the South versus the East Coast, West Coast, and then Midwestern people. In the South, I've noticed more people are just like, whatever, like not really judging so much. It's more so like, who's your family? You know, what family do you come from? What status does your family have? What cultural background do you have? What kind of manners do you have? What kind of etiquette do you have? Do you carry yourself with class? I've noticed that that's kind of the theme from what I've noticed with Southern people versus other people. Like on the West Coast, people have definitely talked shit. I've noticed people talking shit about people's clothing, their makeup, you know, their fillers or Botox or hair extensions or whatever. Same thing with the East Coast. I've noticed that the fashion sense needs to be on point on the East Coast from what I've noticed. It seems like a lot of different phenotypes have been accepted, whether the woman is unambiguous, whether she's Hispanic or some sort of mixed race woman. But I've noticed that if you have some sort of kind of quote unquote exotic black phenotype, I've noticed that guys may be more open with you actually. And they might say, like, oh, you know, I like how you look or I like your phenotype. But like I said, though, you should not take any of this seriously because men are going to lie and say that they prefer you because obviously they want you to sleep with them. So, of course, they're going to say that. Another thing that I forgot to mention is like if you're a smart pretty girl, intellectualism is highly pedestalized in the South, or at least from what I've experienced. And this is because there are a lot of ignorant people in the South. So I just feel like if you're a pretty girl who's also smart, your intelligence and the way that you articulate yourself, that greatly adds to your social status. Something else that one of you guys mentioned in the Discord is that you've never received the whole "you look like siblings" thing in the South. I noticed that as well. I've never heard a Southern person say about two mixed race people or two light skinned people or something, oh, you guys look like siblings. No, I've only heard West Coast people making that comment. I've never heard East Coast people saying that. I don't think I've ever heard Midwest people saying that or Southern people. I've only heard kind of like West Coast people or people who have never really been around that many like mixed race people. Something else that I forgot to mention about the South is like if you went to an HBCU, you are pedestalized. Or at least in my case, I've been pedestalized for graduating from an HBCU because there are a lot of friends that I've made because they've gone to HBCUs. So like meeting other exoticals, and then she'll be like, "Oh, I went to this HBCU," and I'm like, "Oh my god, I went to that HBCU." And then in terms of like dating and stuff, if you are dating, then I feel like if you are an HBCU graduate, you get to go back and forth and have kind of like the banter with HBCU graduates and kind of like talk shit about each other's HBCUs. You could be like, "Oh, well, you may think you're the shit because MLK is from your HBCU, but this person is from my HBCU." So it's kind of cool getting to meet other people who have kind of a similar experience. Another thing that I forgot to say is land ownership. Oh, and something else too is when I say the South, I'm not just talking about like Texas, Georgia, Florida. I'm talking about anything that's considered the South. So Arkansas, Alabama, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, all of those places, Oklahoma, Virginia. Those are all of the states that I'm including when I'm talking about the South. Something else that I've noticed is in terms of pretty privilege, no matter what your hairstyle is, kind of like having quote unquote flaws in your hair. So let's say your hair gets a little bit frizzy from the humidity. Let's say you're wearing your hair in a natural hairstyle. I just noticed that lace front. This lace front thing, I did not notice that in the South. I didn't really notice that in terms of Southern culture or Southern women. So when people talk about all of these extreme lace fronts, I don't know what geographical region they're talking about. I don't know where those women are from. That could be more of an inner city thing though, because like I said, the types of black people that I've been around, they're more like the Barack Obama black people or like the, I don't know, kind of upwardly mobile black people. So I don't know if the whole lace front thing is more of a hood culture thing, but just generally speaking, I haven't really seen lace front culture as much with Southern women. Something else that is very unique about the South is black privilege. I said what I said. The South is the only region in the United States where I've ever lived where I have seen lots of black people, unambiguous or not, where they are executive directors, owners of different companies, HR managers and stuff, hiring managers, just very upwardly mobile. The South is the only place where I have seen black people successfully bully white people out of their jobs, or they will successfully bully non-black people or like people who are not black enough, myself included. That's the only place where I've seen black people successfully exercise black privilege in order to like get people out of positions that they don't like them being in. So that is something that I've only noticed in the South. I've never witnessed that in any other place that I've ever been. Not on the West Coast, not in the Midwest, not on the East Coast. Another thing that I'll say too is in terms of colorism. You know how some dark skinned black women will say, "Oh, I'm at the bottom." Not in the South, not from what I've noticed. Whenever I've been around Southern people or living in the South, I have not seen anybody, except for that one guy, but that was when I was a teenager. I have not seen anybody say comments like, "I don't date dark skinned black women," or "I don't prefer dark skinned black women." All of the dark skinned women that I know, they're dating whoever they want, whether he's a white guy, he's black, he's, I don't know, mixed race. And I will say also, I have never met a dark skinned black unambiguous woman who is a divester in real life. Like, as far as my experience with people in the South, never seen that. So part of me thinks that this is just an online thing for women to kind of get the attention of black men or to try to like grift people. I don't know. But in terms of femininity, another thing that I like about Southern culture is your hyper femininity. Like if you wear a lot of floral prints, lots of halter dresses, lots of high heels, if you like big hair, especially if you like synthetic hair, kind of like me, so I kind of like big hair and stuff, that is not demonized in the South. In fact, that is considered cute, it's considered pretty. I've noticed that you don't have to have as much of this effortless look. I will say that as far as try hard beauty, like super duper fillers and Botox and big fake boobs and stuff, that's more of a West Coast cultural thing versus the South. In the South, it's more like you can kind of look like whatever, and you will be able to find somebody who likes your exact phenotype. So I just feel like there are a lot of different types of pretty privileges that you can tap into as an exotical in the South. It was funny because I actually met this one girl and she was from the South. She was actually from one of my favorite cities in the South. And I was asking her like, "Oh my God, how do you like it in that city?" And she was like, "Oh, I don't really like it. I don't get what the hype is about." But then when she told me the exact city she lived in, she was not in that city. She was in the suburbs. And so I will say that if you are considering moving or if you care about social climbing, maybe you want to social climb in a particular city, this is exactly what I did. You know what? Maybe I'll make another video on my members page or on my Patreon talking about how I actually moved across the country multiple times, actually. I've done this specifically for social climbing reasons. So, one of the main things that I take into consideration when moving is actually dating is a really big one. I practice decentered dating. And it's funny because even my boyfriend, he specifically moved to the city that I'm in as well because of his personal social climbing goals. So I would say if you're considering moving to a certain place, what's most important to you? What are your goals with living in that particular city? I know for me, when it comes to where I live, guess what? I only want to live where I am considered beautiful and gorgeous and pretty and I'm pedestalized. I don't give a fuck what anybody thinks. Number two, I want to live in a place where I feel like I can build wealth. So a place where maybe they have lots of jobs in my field. Like I specifically moved to a place where they had lots of jobs in my career field. I've done that multiple times. So what's most important to you? Do you have kids? Is it about like the public school system in that particular city? Is it about dating? I know that for me, my priorities were cost of living, upward mobility, job opportunities, and also my pretty privilege. How is it being in that community? What ethnicities and what groups of people appreciate my exact phenotype the most? And what cities do those people live in? Do I prefer to live in a city where there are more white people, more black people, more Asian people, Arab people? So those are all things that I think about. Anyway, what do you ladies think? Let me know in the comment section and I'll talk to you next time. Stay pretty, ladies.